Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. We actually got the three of us together. Elizabeth actually initiated this, and she reached out to me and to Deborah saying, hey, there's a really cool conference going on. Do you want to attend it? Where like the three of us kind of teamed up to attend the Institute of Child Psychology's conference on mental health back at the end of October. And we said, hey, let's all go. Let's kind of divide and conquer. We shared thoughts. And then we said, hey, what can we do to bring some of these thoughts combined with our own experiences to members of our tribes or folks that we can influence and support in supporting their preteens and teens. So this is the first of what hopefully will be a number of workshops that we put on together over the next however long or whatever time frame.
I would have the great pleasure of introducing Clarissa Constantine. And I met Clarissa when we went through this in November 2020 Children's Mental Health Conference. And I've been so impressed by her. So I'm really pleased to be able to do this. Clarissa is an only child who had a tough relationship with her mom. And during college at the University of Hartford, which is in my backyard, she began what would turn into a decades-long career as a test prep coach. She's helped thousands of kids around the world navigate the college and grad school admissions processes. Along the way, she's joked that she sometimes finds herself playing the role of therapist more than tutor, helping kids manage the stresses of their life. But no matter how many young adults she helped, she longed for a closer, more intimate relationship with her own mother. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass because her mom passed away in November 2019. Clarissa is driven to help other families avoid the heartache, the lost years, and the regret she, and most likely her mom too, experienced. In addition to test prep coaching and dreaming of the ways parent-tween connection will help families, she's also a certified life coach who helps teens learn concepts like goal setting, self-compassion, and self-esteem, mindfulness, and growth mindsets. So without further ado, take it away, Clarissa.
Thank you. And again, thanks to all of you for being here. It's always cool to say, hey, here's some information. Let's do what we can to help make life a little bit easier, hopefully, a little more fun along the way. So as we start with mindset, I'm curious if you would either type to me or go ahead and come on mic. What do you think when you hear the term mindset? Because it's kind of become a buzzword. So what are your thoughts? Life perspective. Okay, absolutely. A frame of reference. Yeah, attitude, approach to life. Absolutely. Okay. All of those, I think, are key. If we were to go back to the dictionary definition, which is where I always start, is it's a fixed attitude or a disposition or a mood, or kind of like an inclination, like what's your tendency towards something? And yes, Kelly, that is exactly where we're going. If you are not familiar with Dr. Carol Dweck, there's an image in there that is somewhat less reflective than the book that I've got. You can tell it's a well-worn book. It's a phenomenal book. Basically, Dr. Dweck takes this concept of mindset, your frame of reference, your life view, your worldview, and she kind of subdivides it into two categories. One is a fixed mindset. The other is growth mindset. So I'm going to propose that if we're here today, there is at least some aspect of us that believes that we have a growth mindset, because we believe that if we can learn and we can adjust something, then things can change. But it really starts with us. So let's start and actually take a look. I know it's super small in this diagram, but fixed mindset, I actually have to acknowledge that I grew up with much more of a fixed mindset than I think my folks tried to engender in me. And we're going to talk about some why that is. With a fixed mindset, there's a belief that intelligence is set, what you're born with. You know, if you believe in God, like when God was passing out good looks and brains and social skills, you got what you got, and that's what you're stuck with. If intelligence is set, then that means that growth isn't possible. It means that obstacles are challenging and, oh, I can't do it, so I'm done and I'm just not going to try. I don't like challenges. I don't put myself out there. Effort? What effort? I can either do it or I can't. I'm either a natural or I'm not. On the other side, though, with a growth mindset, we go, hey, you know what? Maybe it wasn't just that like I got 1 cup of brains and a half a cup of good looks. Maybe I can shift things around along the way. Maybe I can learn. Maybe I can grow. I look at challenges as opportunities. And this goes back to what Elizabeth was saying, especially in those middle school years, setting up the opportunity for kids to fail, not because we want them to fail, but because we want to engender in them the idea that failure isn't bad. Failure is a learning opportunity, not the end of the world, right? Now, when you have a mom who I'm sure was well-intentioned, but like when I was in 9th grade, back in the day when class ranking was the thing, in 9th grade, I was first in my class. Like I was like 1 out of 143. What does that mean? And I literally remember going up to my high school, my English teacher, Dr. Bucklew. She was my homeroom teacher, going, Dr. Bucklew, what does this mean? And she's like, oh, you're first in your class. I was like, oh, cool. I graduated. I was 7th in my class. And you know what my mom said to me? Well, that's great, but why weren't you first? Right, Catherine? Like seriously, like 7th wasn't great. I still had almost straight A's, right? But in my world, the world that I grew up in, and I acknowledge now that it's because my mom wanted me to have every opportunity that I could have. And from her experience, good grades were the way to get there. But the message that I got was, you can't fail. So know that, right? Exactly. You don't win the silver, you lose the gold. You're the first loser if you're second, right? So keeping in mind that some of these things that we talk about, like we don't encourage our kids to fail. We don't encourage them to see failure as a learning opportunity. So when we start talking about mindset and we acknowledge, hey, mindset can change, in order to help our kids cultivate growth mindsets, we have to be conscious, number one, that we have a growth mindset, or at least some aspect of it. But we also have to pay attention to the messages that we're sending to our kids, because just as we have a growth mindset doesn't necessarily mean it comes out our mouths as a growth mindset. So I'm actually going to reference a couple of pieces rather than like trying to summarize it. I'm actually going to pull a couple of pieces out directly from Dr. Dweck's book. So I'm curious, how many of you have said or have heard friends or colleagues say, wow, you learned that so quickly. You're smart. You're so smart. Or, wow, look at the drawing that Julia just did. Julia's the next Picasso. Julia, I'm picking on you. Love you, friend. Or, wow, you're so brilliant. You got an A without even trying. Like you didn't even crack a book. How many of you have heard that? Right? And how many of us are like, wow, that's positive. We're reinforcing, like we're complimenting our kids, right? We're praising them. Part of the challenge, and I see Catherine going like this, right? Part of the challenge is kids hear things differently. Other people hear them differently. So part of the message that they can hear is, if I don't learn something quickly, I'm not smart. Or, oh, well, I really shouldn't try drawing anything any harder than this, because then they're not going to think I'm a very good artist. Or, well, they said that I'm super brilliant because I did that without studying. If I study, I'm not very brilliant. I'm not very smart. So part of the challenge that we need to consider is when we praise the end goal and we praise the success, like the ultimate first place, grade A, gold medal, then if they're so focused on that end performance, the second they hit a snag, they're like, oh, I'm out. Nope, I'm done. It's too hard. So what should we consider as an alternative? And to be fair, we've got primarily, if not exclusively, women here. I see this more in my students, among my young ladies, than I do among my young men. We tend to be really, really hard on ourselves, perhaps because this is the message that we've gotten about, like, it's the end goal, right? We don't give ourselves grace when we screw up. Anybody else? Right? We don't give ourselves that flexibility. We don't embrace the change. So this is something that we need to consider. We need to consider that we don't know all of this yet. We're learning. Yes, we're adults, but we clearly don't have it all figured out yet because we're still learning, and that's okay. So we want to extend this grace and these considerations to ourselves as well. So if we're going to focus more on the journey, I've got some examples here. Dancers, musicians, academics, athletes. What are some things that we could say instead of, wow, you won the race, or, oh, you had a great ballet solo? What are some of the things that we could embrace, that we could encourage and recognize in the process? Go ahead and type to me or unmute. Indeed, Elizabeth. What are some of the stepping stones we can recognize in these journeys? Absolutely, Catherine, your hard work is paying off. Good job taking a risk and trying something new. I'm really proud of you for putting yourself out there. Absolutely. Absolutely. We could say, exactly, Jenna, you finished. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely, Elizabeth. So when I look at these, and these are some experiences that I've had. I was a dancer when I was a kid. I'm a musician. I'm a runner, frustrated runner, but a runner, right? If you have a dancer or an actor or musician in your life, wow, I loved the passion that you put into your practice or your rehearsal. Or, wow, I'm listening to your scales and it sounds like your fingers are learning how to play your scales better. And it feels like that's becoming more comfortable for you. Or, wow, I love the fact that, yeah, you didn't win the race, but you know what? You made it to the gym 4 days a week for the last 7 weeks. And I can tell how much more confident you are going up to the starting line. So I really encourage you to consider, what are those process-oriented pieces that we can acknowledge, right? And what about for us? Like, I'm sitting here, it's New Year. One of my goals was to try to get a little healthier, drop some weight. The darn scale isn't moving, but you know what I'm acknowledging myself for? That I've done yoga. I have done a downward dog every single day this year. And you know what? The scale will move someday. And if it doesn't, I've still done downward dog every day this year, right? So acknowledging the process and looking at the pieces that will, the pieces that we know will ultimately get us there. Thank you, Elizabeth. Granted, it was 1 o'clock this morning and I said to my husband, I haven't done my full yoga practice because, of course, in typical me style, I finished this last night. And I'm like, I'm going to do my downward dog. And so I did it right next to the bed, but I did it. All right. So again, thinking about the journey. Right, Deborah, thank you. So we also want to think about messages that we send when the kids around us don't see the success that they would like. So Dr. DeWitt gives an example in here of a 9-year-old, reasonably new gymnast who goes to her first meet and doesn't place, doesn't win, she showed up, but she didn't win anything, which of course is devastating for a 9-year-old. And so Dr. Dwight gives 5 examples of how we could respond to this. The first one, tell her that you thought she was the best. Well, the challenge with that is she's going to be like, yeah, whatever, but the judges didn't. So mom, dad, coach, whatever, your opinion kind of doesn't matter. The second that she offers, Dr. Dweck offers, is to say, well, you were robbed. What do you think the challenge is there? I can see Catherine going like, oh, no. Well, the challenge there is that you're taking the responsibility off of the student. Maybe she wasn't robbed. Maybe she just wasn't that good. Exactly. It's making it somebody else's fault. A third option is to say, well, gymnastics isn't that important anyway. Here's the thing. And that's something I actually remember my mom saying, and I know it was well-intentioned, but the catch is if it's something that they didn't succeed at and you tell them that it's not that important anyway, the message that we're sending is that trying something new doesn't matter. And that if they're not naturally good at it and they don't naturally walk away with the gold, it's not worth doing. So be cognizant of that. Fourth option is be like, well, I know you can do it. I'm sure you're going to win next time. Well, what makes you so sure I didn't win this time? And so there's an aspect where that can undermine your relationship with the kid. And by the way, when I say your kid, to be clear, I'm actually not a mom, but I've been a coach. And so when I say your kid, I don't necessarily mean like your child, but your stepkids, your mentees, the kids that you coach. Know that I use that like broadly, okay? Dr. Dweck proposes it saying, well, I'm sure you're going to win next time is actually potentially the most dangerous of all of these. Because she says, does it automatically take you where you want to go? Does the kid learn from the process? Does the kid think like, well, I'm just going to get it next time? Probably. And so that's a really dangerous step that we want to take. So if you had to guess, what do you think a more appropriate or more effective response might be when you have a kiddo who doesn't achieve their goal? Any thoughts? Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. Going, hey, you know, what went well? Again, in that process, did you show up at the gym four times a week for 7 weeks? What did go well? Identifying, you know, what worked and what we want to recreate. Here's what she actually says. Be honest with your kid that they didn't earn it yet. They didn't deserve that gold yet. Because, hey, there could be other kids. Maybe you've only been doing gymnastics for 6 months or a year, but there's other kids who've been doing it for 5 years. They've developed their skills more. Maybe you only went to the gym twice a week outside of going to the gymnastics studio. Maybe you need to go more frequently. And yeah, it's hard to be like, but you don't deserve it. But if we encourage the idea that it can still be attained, then that can help them increase the likelihood of trying again. Now, it's also interesting that there are some cultural aspects to this. In our culture, failure can be very, very demoralizing and demotivating. And yet, if you transition and consider, for example, some Asian countries, Japan, China, Korea, education is highly, highly, highly revered, highly valued, and very like culturally prioritized. In those cultures, academic failure is a huge motivator because they're like, oh, I didn't put my best in. I want to go do more. So recognize that there are also other cultural implications, like Elizabeth and Deborah have talked about, like this, what's going on in the classrooms. But to the extent that we have influence in our little microcosms, we can help adjust that as well. So it's really important that we look for evaluating the process. And this is something I see that Deborah had mentioned. I do test prep. Not only do I work with high school kids on SAT and ACT for college admissions, but I work with grad school bound students. Lately, I've been teaching or coaching a ton of LSAT, which is the law school admissions test. And I see this in my 25 and 30 and 40-year-old students. You know, it'll be like, you know, I give them a short drill and they're like, oh, I only got 3 out of 4. I'm like, dude, that's 75% accuracy. You were at 25% accuracy 10 minutes ago. And you're at 75% accuracy now. Look at the growth. And they're like, but it's not perfect. Oh my God, you're a grown adult. And so that's why I say, like, acknowledge that we fall into this as well. Remember that, especially once we have our kids in that middle school into high school range, like Elizabeth was saying, you know, we're not the automatons or the autocrats anymore. We're not dictating things. We're adjusting more into modeling and coaching and mentoring as we are directing. And so the more that we can work to not bring judgment in and to use the opportunity to teach and to learn from, and like Elizabeth was saying earlier, you know, Jenna, you were like, well, how do I approach this? And Elizabeth was like, well, maybe acknowledge to your kid that you don't have it perfect and be like, it's okay, I made a mistake. That vulnerability to your kids shows them it's okay to be human and it's okay to make a mistake. And that if it's okay for us to make a mistake, it makes it more okay for them to make mistakes as well. And just be like, hey, we're all learning. Cool? Thoughts? Okay, Jenna, I see you grinning. Any thought coming out of your head that you want to share?
I used to say to my daughter, oh, I just made my very first mistake ever. And she'd go, Mom, you make mistakes all the time. And I go, oh, okay, well, no big deal. So she understood that making mistakes didn't really alter who I was or what I was doing or my mood.
Mm-hmm. Good. Love it. No worries, Kelly. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so one of the things that I want you to consider, and this very much comes from my own experience and keeping in mind, like in my coaching that I do with families and teenagers and parents, it's a lot about how to maintain connection with your kiddos. Because if you can maintain those stronger ties, then it makes navigating a lot of these difficult things easier. I'm not going to say easy, but easier. And I would argue that any of us in mentorship, parental coach roles, we want what's best for our kids. What comes up though is that our definition of what's best doesn't always match the kid's definition of what's best. Have we ever seen this? Perhaps you lived it as the teen. That's certainly what I did. And this is where a lot of what Elizabeth was saying of like asking them. One of my favorite words or favorite phrases is tell me more. Or why is that? Or what if, like asking exploratory questions to get the kids sharing more about them. Here's why I invite you to consider this. And again, this is 100% from my own experience. I believe my mom 100% wanted what was best for me. Her definition of what was best for me and my definition of what was best for me frequently did not align. And what ended up happening, Elizabeth and Deborah were talking about like this, right? that happens in those teenage years. Unfortunately for us, we ended up continuing on spending so much time, effort, and energy trying to prove that what we believed was right or what was best was right. And we lost the ability somewhere along the way to be kind in that process because we were so emphatic trying to prove that we were right. And so this speaks to one of the things that Dr. Dweck discusses about we love you, but only on our terms, only if you fit into this box. And so I encourage you to consider, and I actually was interviewed for a podcast called Blended on the Bluff a couple of weeks ago. She specializes in working with blended families. And she has a very strong faith-based approach to it. And I said, one of the things that, we were talking about, one of the things that can come up is that oftentimes we're teaching kids morals and values based in our belief system. And that's exactly what my mom did with me. And what I felt was missing was the fact that she would love me anyway, even if I stepped out of that, even if I made a mistake, even if XYZ outside of her box. So I encourage you to consider what boxes perhaps we have defined for our teenagers in terms of, conditions based upon, them in some way feeling that our love or support or rah-rah cheerleading is conditional in some fashion. So be aware of that. Just consider it in the messages that you're sending to folks. TED Talk. I don't know which TED Talk. Okay. All right. So one little tidbit that I think Catherine might be the only person who knows here, and you might not know that either, Catherine, is I actually was a personal trainer for 8 years. Catherine said no. I've known Catherine since we both lived in San Diego, like 17 years ago. No, that was a podcast I was on. So I was interviewed just a couple of weeks ago. It's called Blended on the Bluff is the woman who interviewed me. So I was a personal trainer. I also openly acknowledge, publicly discuss the fact that my husband and I both deal with diagnosed mental illness. And so going back probably a decade or 12 years, I started doing a lot of research on the brain-body connection Now, you're probably going, what the heck does this have to do with mindset? Well, let's lay a couple of foundations first of all. Here are some numbers about what's going on here in the US as of almost 2 years ago. 1 in 5 teenagers qualifies as obese in this, or at least overweight in this country. That's a lot. But of course, we always look at it from the physical side of things, right? But what about the mental side? What about the, not just the mental health, but the actual academic side of things? So in going and doing research, according to the National Institute of Health here in the US, numerous studies have shown an inverse relationship between obesity as measured by BMI. Now, I will acknowledge that BMI is imperfect, but it is a measurement tool. But they've acknowledged an inverse relationship between being overweight or obese and grades, right? So what does this tell us? Well, it's not necessarily causative, but it's at least correlative in that there are physiological things that go on when we have more weight on our bodies that absolutely impact our brain. How many of you recognize that a lot of us walk around like we're a society of bobbleheads? Like we acknowledge what's going on up here, but we don't necessarily recognize how what's up here attaches to what's down here and how they play together. So I absolutely 100% agree, Deborah. A lot of concern comes from fear. So when we start then looking at the relationship between being overweight and obesity, certainly it makes sense that there are psychological impacts, right? When you've got the big kid, or frankly, the underweight, the small kid, right? That's who my husband was when he was in high school. You get the bullying, you get the nastiness, you get the, hey, fatty, or like the really, truly like horrid things, right? Oh, Julia, hang tight on that. We'll come back to that, okay? But here's the thing. Not only do we end up with the bullying, the low self-esteem, we also find that the psychosocial impact is that kids tend to lose the idea that things will be okay, that things will work out. So like you were talking with blended families earlier, Elizabeth, about like taking the long view. Kids don't have that. They just don't have the capacity to do that. So again, we don't necessarily know like which came first, the chicken or the egg, whether it's the bullying and the abuse and such that leads to the physical increase in weight or the physical increase in weight that leads to the bullying, but it really does become a cycle. So when we look at this and we think about like, hey, how does this play into mental capacity? Well, this is where another one of my favorite books comes in. If you have not read this, I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to do so, not only for your kids, but also for yourselves. Dr. Rady, as you can see, is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Exercise is the single most powerful tool we have to optimize brain function. And so what do we have going on today with the pandemic? Kids sitting in front of screens a lot, kids not getting out, kids not moving, likely driving each other crazy, possibly fighting with siblings more. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we're not getting the movement, even just getting up and moving classes. One of the most fascinating studies that Dr. Rady references in here is actually out of a school system in Naperville, Illinois, where they implemented period 0 hour PE. Basically, it's like the kids would come in and get exercise before school. Now their requirements, they all used heart rate monitors and they had to stay between 80 and 90% of their theoretical maximum heart rate, which here's the thing, you can't judge without a heart rate monitor. And they even acknowledge in discussing the study that kids who look like they're just trudging and not really doing much could actually be working at that high of a heart rate level. And what they found was that the kids who were in the 0 period PE class showed a 17% improvement in their reading and comprehension in a longitudinal literacy study that they were conducting, compared with less than 11% improvement of the kids who didn't participate in period 0 PE. The kids who were in it and at least did like a mile, 10, 12, 15 minutes at 80 to 90% of their theoretical max saw at least 50% more improvement than the kids who didn't. So of course they weren't going, well, why? What is that? So I'm not going to get into the full biology on this, which I could totally nerd out on, but how many of you have heard of neurotransmitters? Okay, they're the magical things in our brains that like send messages back and forth. Okay, these are some of them. Like you may have heard, you know, serotonin. If you can't sleep, you may have a serotonin deficiency. So if you take serotonin at night, it can help quiet the neurotransmission and such, and it'll help you go to sleep. Many of our mental health related medications are, you know, focus in on one or two of these. And I'm not going to say that medication is inappropriate. That would be highly irresponsible of me to say. Reach out to your medical professional if that's something that you're concerned about. What I can tell you is that physiologically, exercise balances out the hormones and the neurotransmitters. So it can be a contributing factor to balancing all of that out. Well, here's the thing. If your neurotransmitters are balanced, they are neurotransmitters. They help the information process more effectively. If the chemicals in our brains are better balanced, messages are going to transfer more effectively. Make sense? They've also identified, oh, very much, Deborah, very much. They've also noticed in studies that as the amount of cardiovascular exercise increases, the amount of brain-derived neurotrophic factor also increases in our brains. Now, BDNF is critical to our ability to learn. And in fact, a study done in Germany that Dr. Rady references back in 2007, but they did a study. They had folks try to memorize vocab words before exercise and then after exercise. And what they found was that after even 15 minutes of exercise, the study participants learned vocab 20% faster than they did beforehand. So I tell all my students, of course, I always put, hang on, I always put the legal schmiegel on it of like, check with your medical professional to ensure that exercise is appropriate for you, okay? But assuming that it is, I tell all of my students that I expect them to go out and go for a run or get on the elliptical or get on the rowing machine and hit it hard for 15 minutes before they come into class. Number one, they're going to be more awake, but number two, they're actually putting their brain in a physiologically more advantaged state to learn. Or downward facing dog, indeed. All right, couple of other things, and then we're going to wrap it up here. Mindfulness. How many of us could use a little more practice of being here now? Okay, now everybody thinks, oh, that's yoga. I don't meditate. Okay, fine, but how many of us couldn't benefit from this? Right? Breathing deep. Here's another really good book. To be fair, I have not actually finished reading it. I borrowed it from the library. I liked it so much. I bought it on Amazon because I wanted to write in it and mark it up. And I haven't gotten all the way through it yet. But much of what this author references, and she actually, she wrote the book with her kiddo. Her kid dealt with debilitating anxiety. And much of this is what she's learned in the process. And there's a lot of really good strategies that you can implement now to help mitigate or help minimize the potential of having your kids deal with anxiety. It's called Understanding Teenage Anxiety by Jennifer Brown with an E. All right, and so one of the short strategies that I'd like to share with you is this. When I ask you, where are your lungs? Where would you typically point? Oh, good. A couple of you are down here. Most students tell me, oh, it's up here, right? They think of like above the girls, as it were, right? But in fact, they are below, on the sides, and even in our backs as well. So I want you to imagine that your lungs are like a balloon. And as you breathe in, Imagine the balloon filling in all directions, front, back, side, side, dropping down. And then when you exhale, that balloon is shrinking. If you consistently, intentionally practice this, 3 to 5 breaths 3 times a day, I would bet that you're going to find your overall levels of stress come down and your ability to manage them goes up. That is an example of mindfulness. It's short spurts of giving your brain a break. I am also a huge fan of this resource. I start every one of my classes with this. If you're in my Facebook group, I've had some pictures of this. This is actually created by a friend of mine at sayitwithgratitude.com. And it's literally a card deck with all these fantastic resources of just questions that you can just ask at the dinner table or ask, while you're out for a walk with your kids or something. Because here's the thing, studies have shown that gratitude increases the happy hormones in your brain. And you cannot at the exact same time be both happy and sad. Granted, the happiness may feel fleeting, but if you can at least take 2 minutes and be like, hey, what am I grateful for? What it ends up doing psychologically is you recognize that much of many of the things that you're grateful for actually come from outside of you. So it helps you gather an appreciation for the people in your community, for nature, for the fact that an animal gave its life for you in order to have a hamburger, or that there's a farmer who grew the grain that created the bread that you're eating. It gives you a stronger sense of community. It can help increase feelings of confidence or belief in a higher power, all of which can contribute to overall better minds, basically. Okay. The last thing that I think is really, really, really important in cultivating a mindset for success is having a community and having a connection. I'm in a Facebook group with a life coach who she posted last night. She was like, who do you go to when you have questions or when you need support? And a couple of people were like, oh, my one best friend or my one this person. And I stopped and I started thinking about it. And I was like, my goodness, I didn't even realize it, but I am so grateful that I have created such a community of people around me that I can lean on. Here's the biggest thing I want you to understand as moms. You are not alone. I don't care what you're going through. You are not the first person to go through it. You are not the last person to go through it. You are not the only person going through it right now. So look for those places. Elizabeth has a phenomenal Facebook group for middle school moms. Deborah has a Facebook group for the Awesome Mom Tribe. I'm the founder of the Parent Tween Connection. Facebook groups, local groups. I know local groups are a challenge right now because of the pandemic, but find people where you can go and ask for help, because you don't have just one friend that you turn to for everything, right? If you don't yet have that tribe, there are people there who can be that for you. Find them. Because that way, when you're in that moment of doubt, that moment of being down, that moment of, I don't know what I'm going to do with my stepkids, right? You can reach out to Elizabeth and be like, dude, you're a stepmom too, help, right? We just had something last night in my Facebook group where a parent came in saying that she's struggling with her transgender son and she doesn't know what to do. I happen to know a mom of a transgender individual. I reached out to that mom and I was like, hey, there was a post in the group. Can you go offer some support? Like, I want to make sure that you saw it. And she totally did and was like, hey, I'll get on the phone with you. I guarantee you are not alone unless you let yourself stay alone. Don't do that. That's not good for mindset. Okay. So that's my perspective. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to say, hey, feel free to connect with me. I know some of you I'm already connected with. There's my email, my Facebook group, and as a gift for anybody who's interested, if you are interested in doing some exploring on how to have a better connection with your kids, that is my specialty outside of the test prep world. Happy to chat about that. And then my final request is, and actually I'll copy and paste this. If you got value out of today, it would really be awesome if you would be kind enough to share on your social media, share the link. We are doing this exact same workshop tomorrow, starting at 2 p.m. Eastern out to 11 o'clock Pacific. So if anybody missed it, or
I do it on my calendar. Is it really 11?
Oh, did I say that wrong? I don't know. What time is it tomorrow?
I hope that it's noon tomorrow, but I'm gonna go check.
We'll confirm it. Yeah,
Mine,
maybe I might have said that wrong.
I've got it 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time.
Okay, perfect. I was wrong. 3 o'clock Eastern Standard, noon Pacific. I'll show up when my calendar tells me to show up. And yes, I absolutely agree. You know, I completely forgot to put that in there. That is one of the foundations of the programming that we do through Parent Tween Connection is volunteerism and philanthropy and giving back. 100% agree on that.